He had seen every kind of performer imaginable. But when this man walked onto the stage with invisible keys, Simon Cowell realized he was about to witness something that would redefine what it means to have nothing, yet possess everything. The America's Got Talent Theater pulsed with its familiar pre-show energy, the kind of electric atmosphere that came from hundreds of dreams converging in one space. The judges sat in their customary positions, cameras positioned at perfect angles to capture every emotion, every surprise, every moment that would become part of television history. Simon Cowell tapped his pen against the red buzzer, his expression maintaining that trademark combination of skepticism and anticipation that had become his signature over decades of judging hopeful performers. Tonight felt like any other Tuesday evening of auditions. The production schedule was running smoothly. The acts had been varied and entertaining, and the audience was responsive to the mix of comedy, music, and spectacle that defined the show's appeal. Simon scanned his notes, mentally calculating commercial breaks and remaining time slots, already thinking ahead to the evening's conclusion. But backstage, in the wings where dreams either flourished or died, something extraordinary was preparing to unfold, something that would challenge every assumption Simon had ever made about talent, dignity, and the relationship between material possession and artistic worth. His name was Marcus Thompson, 55 years old, and he was wearing the only clothes he owned, a faded gray suit jacket that had once belonged to someone else, donated pants that were slightly too short, and shoes held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. In his weathered hands, he carried what appeared to be a large piece of cardboard, carefully folded and creased, with black and white rectangles drawn across its surface in precise proportions. To anyone watching, it looked like trash. To Marcus, it was a Steinway grand piano, the instrument that had once been his voice, his language, his reason for breathing. Marcus had not always been homeless. 5 years ago, he had been Dr. Marcus Thompson, professor of music at the University of Southern California, a concert pianist who had performed in Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and the most prestigious venues across 3 continents. He had owned a beautiful home in Beverly Hills, drove a car that cost more than most people earned in a year, and slept each night in a bed surrounded by Grammy nominations and photographs with musical legends. But addiction doesn't discriminate based on education or achievement. Prescription painkillers, initially prescribed for a repetitive stress injury in his right wrist, had gradually consumed everything Marcus had built over 30 years of disciplined practice and professional success. First his marriage, then his job, then his home, and finally his dignity had disappeared into the bottomless hunger of opioid dependency. The piano had been the last thing to go. Marcus had held on to his Steinway longer than anything else, practicing scales in an empty house while the bank prepared foreclosure notices. He had played Chopin nocturnes while sitting on furniture that belonged to creditors. He had performed Bach inventions while his utilities were disconnected one by one. The day they came to repossess his piano had been the day Marcus understood that he had lost more than an instrument. He had lost his identity, his purpose, the physical manifestation of everything he had ever been or hoped to become. That had been 5 years ago. Since then, Marcus had lived in shelters, doorways, and the shadowed spaces beneath freeway overpasses. He had stood in food lines, slept in cardboard boxes, and learned the specific geography of a city that looked very different when you experienced it from sidewalk level. But Marcus had never stopped being a pianist. Every morning he would find a quiet corner and practice scales on surfaces that existed only in his memory. He would perform complete concertos in the air, his fingers moving across invisible keys with the muscle memory of 3 decades spent in service to music. He would close his eyes and hear full orchestras accompanying his silent performances, transforming concrete and despair into Carnegie Hall. The cardboard piano had been born from necessity and nostalgia. Marcus had spent weeks studying real pianos in music store windows, carefully measuring proportions, memorizing the exact spacing between keys. He had drawn the keyboard with meticulous precision, using permanent markers stolen from office supply stores and rulers found in dumpsters behind schools. The cardboard came from a refrigerator box that Marcus had called home for 2 months, behind a grocery store. When the store manager finally asked him to move along, Marcus had carefully cut and folded the cardboard into a portable instrument that could accompany him wherever his nomadic existence led. To passers-by on the street, Marcus looked like a crazy homeless man playing an imaginary piano. Children would point and giggle, adults would hurry past, avoiding eye contact with someone whose presence reminded them how thin the line was between success and catastrophe. Police officers would occasionally ask him to move along, treating his music as a form of loitering rather than art. But Marcus continued to practice. He would set up his cardboard piano in park corners, beside bus stops, in the forgotten spaces where the homeless gathered to maintain whatever dignity the world had left them. His fingers would dance across the drawn keys with the same precision and passion he had once brought to concert halls, performing for audiences of pigeons and people who had also learned what it meant to be invisible. The idea of auditioning for America's Got Talent had come from an unlikely source. Marcus had been performing his daily practice routine in Pershing Square, his cardboard piano spread across a bench, when a young woman with a smartphone had stopped to watch. She had recorded his performance of what appeared to be air piano, then approached him afterward. "That was beautiful," she had said simply. "What were you playing?" "Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor," Marcus had replied, surprised that anyone had bothered to ask. The woman had introduced herself as Jenny, a music student at UCLA. She had recognized the complex finger patterns, the emotional phrasing, the subtle dynamics that Marcus was executing despite having no actual instrument to produce sound. "You should audition for AGT," Jenny had suggested. "People need to see this. They need to understand that music doesn't disappear just because you lose your piano." Marcus had laughed, a sound that carried 5 years of accumulated bitterness. They don't put homeless people on television unless they're being arrested or asking for spare change. But Jenny had been persistent. She had helped Marcus navigate the audition process, provided him with information about casting calls, and even offered to drive him to the preliminary screening. More importantly, she had convinced him that his story, his refusal to let circumstances destroy his identity as a musician, was worth sharing with the world. The stage manager approached him in the wings. "Mr. Thompson, you're up." Marcus nodded, unfolding his cardboard piano with the same careful attention he had once given to adjusting the bench height on a concert Steinway. He had practiced this moment dozens of times in shelters and doorways, but standing here in the wings of America's Got Talent, he realized that no amount of preparation could ready someone for the moment, when private perseverance becomes public vulnerability. He walked onto the stage carrying his cardboard piano and 5 years of accumulated dignity, hoping that somewhere in the bright lights and camera lenses, people would be able to see the musician he had never stopped being. The audience's reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. Confused murmurs, suppressed laughter, the kind of nervous energy that comes from not understanding whether something is meant to be taken seriously. Marcus looked exactly like what he was, a homeless man who appeared to be carrying trash onto the stage of a major television production. Simon leaned forward, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention. Something about this contestant's bearing, the careful way he handled his cardboard instrument, suggested this was not going to be a typical audition. "Hello," Simon said, his voice carrying clearly across the theater. "What's your name?" "Dr. Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice carrying traces of the authority and precision that had once commanded university lecture halls. Simon's eyebrows raised slightly at the title. "Doctor of what, Marcus?" "Music," Marcus said simply. "Piano performance and composition. I was a professor at USC for 15 years. The audience's confused murmuring intensified. Here was someone claiming advanced degrees and university positions while standing on stage in donated clothes, holding what appeared to be a piece of decorated cardboard. "And what happened?" one of the other judges asked gently. Marcus looked down at his cardboard piano, then back at the judges. "I became addicted to prescription painkillers after a wrist injury. Lost my job, my home, my family. I've been living on the streets for 5 years." The silence that followed was immediate and uncomfortable. This wasn't the typical contestant backstory of dreams deferred or obstacles overcome. This was someone acknowledging complete systemic failure, standing in front of millions of people, and admitting that he had lost everything society considers valuable. "But you brought a piano with you?" Simon observed, looking at the cardboard instrument. Marcus smiled sadly. "I brought the only piano I can afford. I made it myself from a cardboard box. I practice on it every day because I'm still a pianist, even if I don't have an actual piano anymore." Simon felt something shift in his chest. Here was someone who had fallen as far as it was possible to fall, yet continued to identify himself by his art rather than his circumstances. "You practice on cardboard," Simon repeated, not as a question, but as an attempt to understand the magnitude of dedication Marcus was describing. "Every day for 5 years, Marcus confirmed. "Scales, arpeggios, complete concertos. My fingers remember what my life has forgotten." Simon looked at the cardboard piano, then at Marcus's hands, noting the careful positioning, the subtle muscle memory evident, even in the way he held his arms. "What are you going to perform for us today?" Simon asked. Marcus's expression grew more serious, more focused. "I'm going to play Chopin's prelude in E minor, Opus 28, number 4. It's a piece about melancholy, about finding beauty in sadness. I thought it was appropriate." Simon nodded slowly. "And you'll be playing this on the memory of every piano I've ever touched," Marcus said simply. "On the echo of every lesson I've ever taught, every student I've ever inspired, every concert I've ever performed. The cardboard is just so you can see where my hands are supposed to be." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the audience thought they understood about music, performance, and the relationship between artist and instrument. "Whenever you're ready," Simon said, his voice softer than usual. Marcus carefully positioned his cardboard piano on the stage floor, knelt beside it, and placed his hands above the drawn keys exactly as he would have approached a concert Steinway. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. What happened next was unlike anything anyone in that theater had ever witnessed. Marcus's fingers moved across the cardboard surface with the precision and passion of a master pianist, executing every note of the Chopin prelude with flawless technique. His body swayed with the phantom music, his face expressing every emotional nuance that the composition demanded. The audience was transfixed. They could see the music in Marcus's movements, hear it in the silence between his gestures, feel it in the way his entire being transformed from homeless man to concert artist. This wasn't pantomime or comedy. This was a virtuoso performance happening entirely in the space between memory and imagination. Simon found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in watching someone play music that existed only in the performer's mind and muscle memory. Marcus's technique was flawless, his interpretation sophisticated, his emotional connection to the music absolutely genuine. As Marcus reached the prelude's melancholy climax, his face showed the same kind of transcendent expression that Simon had seen on the faces of the world's greatest pianists. This man was not pretending to play piano, he was actually playing piano. The absence of sound didn't diminish the reality of the performance. When Marcus completed the final phrase, his hands lingered above the cardboard keys for a moment, exactly as they would have over the sustaining pedal of a real piano. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the judges, returning from whatever musical space he had inhabited during the performance. The silence that followed was profound. The audience seemed unsure whether to applaud for music they couldn't hear, but something about Marcus's performance had been so genuinely moving that applause felt inadequate. Simon stood up from the judges' table. For the second time in the show's history, he walked around the table and approached the stage. "Marcus," Simon said, climbing onto the stage, "I want to tell you something." Marcus looked up at him from his position beside the cardboard piano, preparing himself for either validation or humiliation. "I've heard thousands of piano performances in my career," Simon said. "I've worked with the most famous pianists in the world, judged countless musical acts, listened to every style and genre imaginable." Marcus waited, uncertain where this was leading. "What you just did," Simon continued, was one of the most moving piano performances I've ever witnessed. not because of technical perfection, though your technique is extraordinary, but because you showed us what music really is." Simon gestured to the cardboard piano. "Music isn't about having the most expensive instrument or the fanciest concert hall. Music is about the connection between the artist and the art, about the refusal to let circumstances destroy what you are inside." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time in years. "You've been homeless for 5 years," Simon said, "but you never stopped being a pianist. You lost your piano, but you didn't lose your music. You created an instrument out of garbage and turned it into a window to your soul." Simon turned to address the entire theater. This man just proved that talent isn't about what you own. It's about who you are when everything else is taken away. Marcus Thompson hasn't just survived homelessness, he's transcended it. Marcus was crying openly now, not from shame or desperation, but from the recognition that someone understood what he had been trying to communicate through 5 years of silent practice. "Marcus," Simon said, "I want to do something for you. But first, I need to ask you something. If you could have any piano in the world, what would it be?" Marcus wiped his eyes, considering the question seriously. "A Steinway Model D Concert Grand. It's what I played in Carnegie Hall 20 years ago. It has the most perfect touch, the most beautiful tone. It's what every serious pianist dreams of." Simon nodded, then looked directly into the main camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus Thompson is about to get his piano back." Simon turned back to Marcus. "I'm personally purchasing a Steinway Model D for you, not just to play, but to own, because talent like yours deserves an instrument worthy of it." Marcus collapsed to his knees beside his cardboard piano, overwhelmed by an act of generosity that seemed impossible to believe. "But there's more," Simon continued. "I'm also arranging for you to have a place to keep that piano. You're getting an apartment, utilities paid for a year, and support to rebuild your life in whatever way you choose." The audience erupted in applause, but Simon wasn't finished. "And finally," Simon said, "I want to offer you a job. My foundation needs a music director, someone to work with young people who think they can't afford to pursue their musical dreams, someone who understands that circumstances don't define capability." Marcus looked at Simon through his tears, then at his cardboard piano, then at the audience who had witnessed his transformation from homeless man to recognized artist. "The cardboard piano stays with me," Marcus said quietly. "It saved my life for 5 years. It reminded me who I was when the world forgot." Simon smiled. "Of course it does, but now it doesn't have to be your only piano." As the golden buzzer was pressed and confetti fell around them, Marcus carefully folded his cardboard piano, the instrument that had kept his identity alive through the darkest period of his life. Soon, he would have a real Steinway, a real home, a real opportunity to rebuild. But the cardboard piano would always remind him that music exists not in instruments, but in the hands and heart of the musician. After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon sat with Marcus backstage, learning more about the 5-year journey from concert halls to street corners. "You know what impressed me most?" Simon said. "Not just that you kept playing, but that you kept practicing. You maintained professional standards even when no one was listening." Marcus nodded. "Music doesn't care about your circumstances. If you stop practicing, you stop being a musician. I couldn't let that happen, even if I was the only one who knew." Simon realized he had learned something profound about the nature of artistic identity, about the difference between having talent and being an artist. 3 months later, Marcus performed his first concert in 6 years, playing his new Steinway Model D for an audience that included many of the homeless individuals he had met during his years on the street. The concert was free, held in Pershing Square, the same place where Jenny had first suggested he audition for AGT. Marcus's story became a catalyst for conversations about homelessness, addiction, and the ways society discards people who could be restored with compassion and opportunity. The Marcus Thompson Foundation, established with Simon's support, provided instruments and lessons for homeless individuals who wanted to reconnect with their musical identities. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus kept his cardboard piano. He would bring it to every performance, every lesson, every speaking engagement, as a reminder that music doesn't require perfect conditions. It only requires someone willing to practice scales on cardboard, to maintain dignity in the face of circumstances, and to refuse to let external failures destroy internal truth. The homeless maestro had found his way home, not to a place, but to a recognition that he had never actually left the world of music. He had simply been practicing in a different venue, with a different instrument, for a different kind of audience, and in television studios around the world, people understood that they had witnessed something more than entertainment. They had seen proof that the most valuable things we possess are the ones that can't be repossessed, stolen, or lost to addiction. They are the gifts that live in our hands, our hearts, and our refusal to surrender what makes us who we are. It wasn't just television that night. It was a masterclass in dignity, a reminder that circumstances are temporary but identity is eternal, and proof that sometimes the most beautiful music is played on instruments that exist only in the space between memory and hope. In the weeks following Marcus's performance, the video of his cardboard piano audition became one of the most shared clips in internet history. But unlike typical viral content, this wasn't shared for entertainment value. People were sharing it as a reminder of something they had forgotten about the nature of talent, perseverance, and human dignity. Comments flooded in from musicians around the world who recognized the technical precision of Marcus's fingerwork, the sophisticated interpretation he brought to the Chopin prelude, and the emotional authenticity that no amount of formal training could fake. Professional pianists posted response videos, acknowledging that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a master musician maintaining his craft under impossible circumstances. Dr. Elena Vasquez, chair of the piano department at Juilliard, wrote an open letter that was published in music journals worldwide. Mr. Thompson's performance reminded me why I became a musician. Not for the instruments, the concert halls, or the applause, but for the pure connection between human soul and musical expression. His cardboard piano was more real than most of the expensive instruments I hear students play without passion. The Steinway that Simon had promised arrived 3 weeks after the audition, delivered to the modest apartment that had become Marcus's first permanent address in 5 years. When the delivery team wheeled the 9-foot concert grand through the door, Marcus sat at the bench and played the same Chopin prelude he had performed on cardboard, but this time, with actual sound filling the space. His neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been feeding stray cats in the apartment courtyard for years, knocked on his door after hearing the music. She had tears in her eyes when Marcus answered. "I had given up on beautiful things," she said simply. "Thank you for bringing music back to this building." Marcus realized that his homelessness had taught him something about music that conservatory training never could, that the most important audience for any performance is often the one you don't expect. The people who need beauty in their lives, but have stopped believing they deserve it. The job at Simon's Foundation proved to be more than employment. It became Marcus's calling. He worked with teenagers who had aged out of foster care, veterans struggling with PTSD, and adults dealing with addiction and housing instability. All of them had musical backgrounds they thought they had lost along with their circumstances. The first thing people lose when life falls apart, Marcus would tell his students, is the belief that they deserve to make music. They think art is a luxury they can't afford. But music doesn't cost anything. It just requires you to remember who you are underneath what's happened to you. Marcus's teaching method was unconventional but effective. He would have students practice on cardboard instruments first, learning to connect with music without depending on expensive equipment. Only after they had rediscovered their musical identity would he introduce them to actual instruments. Sarah, a 19-year-old former foster child who had been living in her car, was one of Marcus's first students. She had played violin throughout middle school but stopped when she entered the foster system and couldn't bring her instrument with her to different placements. Marcus helped her create a cardboard violin, teaching her to practice bow techniques and finger positions without needing an actual instrument. When she finally played a real violin again, after 3 years of silence, she cried through her entire first scale, "I thought I'd forgotten how," she told Marcus, "but my hands remembered everything." "Your hands never forgot," Marcus replied. "They were just waiting for permission to remember." The Marcus Thompson Foundation grew rapidly, supported not only by Simon's initial funding but by donations from musicians and music lovers around the world who had been moved by his story. Music stores began donating instruments that needed repair, which Marcus and his students would restore together, learning instrument maintenance while developing their playing skills. But Marcus never forgot the lessons of his cardboard piano years. Every month, he would return to the streets where he had lived, bringing portable instruments and offering music lessons to current, homeless individuals. These sessions weren't charity performances but genuine educational opportunities, teaching scales and basic technique to people who thought music was something that only happened to other people. "Music doesn't care about your address," Marcus would tell these informal students. "It only cares about your willingness to practice." The cardboard piano that had sustained Marcus through 5 years of homelessness found a permanent place of honor in the Foundation's main office. Students would often ask about it, and Marcus would explain that it represented something more important than any expensive instrument. It proved that music exists independently of material resources. "This cardboard piano," he would say, running his hands along its drawn keys, "was my Steinway. When I couldn't afford a Steinway, it kept my fingers moving, my mind sharp, my identity intact. It reminded me every day that I was still a musician, even when the world had forgotten." Jenny, the UCLA student who had first encouraged Marcus to audition, graduated with her music degree and joined the Foundation staff as its outreach coordinator. She had been documenting homeless musicians throughout Los Angeles, discovering dozens of trained artists who were living on the streets while maintaining their musical practices in various creative ways. Simon visited the Foundation regularly, not for publicity or photo opportunities, but to understand how his investment was creating ripple effects throughout the community. He was particularly impressed by Marcus's approach to teaching, which emphasized rebuilding identity before rebuilding technique. "I've funded a lot of music programs over the years," Simon confided to Marcus during one visit, "but this is the first one that understands that music education isn't about creating performers. It's about restoring dignity." 2 years after his audition, Marcus performed with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Before the performance, he placed his cardboard piano on stage beside the concert Steinway. "This cardboard piano taught me that music doesn't require perfect conditions," he announced to the audience. "It only requires someone willing to practice scales on cardboard, to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances, and to believe that art is more powerful than adversity." The performance was flawless and genuine. Marcus played with the same emotional authenticity he had brought to his cardboard performances, proving that technical excellence means nothing without the willingness to be vulnerable. After the final encore, Marcus returned to his cardboard piano and played one final scale, his fingers moving across the drawn keys with the same precision and love he had shown every day for 5 years when the world had written him off as worthless. Marcus Thompson had proven that homelessness could steal his house, his job, his family, and his dignity, but it couldn't steal his music. That lived in his hands, in his memory, in his refusal to let circumstances define capability. The cardboard piano remained on stage permanently, a reminder that music transcends material conditions, that art is more powerful than circumstances, and that sometimes the most beautiful performances are the ones that happen on instruments that exist only in the space between determination and hope.